Okay, so the reading I'm going to do is kind of it's pretty far into the book. And if you haven't read the book, the main character, Vivian Lee, joins a sports company called Smart Sports in Portland, Oregon, where her nemesis is a guy named Duncan Dorick. And this is a chapter when the executive team is on a scuba diving trip in Australia. So it's chapter 22, In Deep Water. On the last day of their scuba trip, sunlight danced on the surface of the clear azure sea, making the water playfully inviting. Rays of light speared the liquid blue, fracturing into thousands of shimmering slivers. Vivian drew in a clean breath of salty, clean sea air. Visibility was so good from the boat that she could see deep into the ocean and make out the coral formations below. As with many of the dives on this trip, this was a wall dive, and they expected to see a lot of pelagics. Matt said, "I'm not making any promises here, but the last boat to dive at this site radioed that a tiger shark was in the area, so maybe we'll get lucky." For all the other dives, Vivian had buddied up with Tim, but this time a change was requested. One of the dive masters said, "Vivian, Tim, this is going to be a challenging dive, and you guys are both very experienced. Would you mind splitting up and each of you diving with one of the less experienced divers?" She hesitated, but then they both agreed. The dive master buddied Vivian up with Duncan and Tim with Johnny O. Duncan was appreciative, but Vivian felt uneasy. A diver essentially puts their life into the hands of their dive buddy, and she wasn't at all sure about giving that kind of responsibility to Duncan. Her gut was telling her to just sit this one out, but in her hundreds of dives, she had never come close to seeing a tiger shark. Despite her reservations about Duncan, Vivian just couldn't pass up this chance. The eyes of all the divers lit up with anticipation, and they suited up with more alacrity. Duncan, as a novice diver, fumbled a bit and moved slowly. Vivian was getting impatient to get into the water. She hated to be the last one in. "Come on, Dunk," she pleaded. "There's going to be some cool stuff on this dive. We don't want to miss a tiger shark, do we?" Right, of course not," Duncan replied unconvincingly. His right hand went up and rubbed the back of his neck. He was stressed out, and he wasn't the only one. Finally, they were ready and stood at the platform, waiting to make their giant stride entry. 6 or 7 reef sharks swam close to the surface near the dive platform. Interesting, the sharks showed no fear of the humans, and why would they? Vivian signaled she was going to go. Once under the water, the two started getting more comfortable diving together. Vivian spotted 2 giant loggerhead turtles and a huge school of barracuda with rows of jagged, pointy teeth and stern gazes. The barracuda huddled together like a bunch of New Yorkers waiting to board the number 2 train to Wall Street. She pointed out the marine life to Duncan, who nodded excitedly. She was tracking a huge pufferfish when a sharp, metallic clang pierced the water. Vivian turned to see Matt, about 40 feet away, banging his tank with his dive knife to get everyone's attention. What was the hullabaloo? Typically, a dive master signaled in this way when there was something unusual or interesting to see, or something dangerous. Matt put his hand in profile against his forehead to signal a shark and spread 4 fingers alongside his abdomen, the unmistakable diver signal for a tiger shark. Vivian felt a rush of exhilaration. She turned to Duncan and saw a strange look on his face. Confusion? She tapped his arm and signaled him to come closer. On her underwater slate, she wrote, "Tiger shark nearby." His eyes grew wide, and he nodded in comprehension. Vivian wiped her slate clean. She strained at her eyes to make out the tiger shark in the distance, but saw nothing. Sharks attacked from below, so she carefully scanned the waters beneath them. Nothing. Again, the clanging sound from Matt. This time, he made a signal instructing everyone to get against the wall. Most of the divers were near Matt and clustered around him. His face revealed an emotion Vivian had not seen in him before: alarm. Then something peculiar happened. Fishes of different species and sizes started whizzing past them, as if on overdrive, all moving in the same direction. A huge school of fish whipped around Vivian and Duncan, who were still out in the open water, making a surgical split and then reforming once they passed the divers, clearly in a hurry to get somewhere or away from something. In all her diving experience, Vivian had never seen that happen. She felt a knot in her gut and knew they had to get to the wall, and fast. Vivian quickly spotted a shallow opening in the wall and motioned to Duncan to swim toward it. He took off in that direction, jerking his head around in a desperate attempt to see what was coming. Vivian followed, keeping her eyes trained on the depths below. Duncan was 15 feet ahead of her when he abruptly stopped and turned. He flailed his arms madly and swam backward into the indent in the wall. When she got closer, she saw his pin-dot pupils and twitching jaw muscle. Duncan was sucking hard on his regulator. Vivian instinctively checked his air supply to make sure he had enough air. She signaled, "Are you okay?" "Slow down your breathing." Duncan was frozen. He didn't move at all. Was he having a panic attack? He grabbed her slate and scrawled, "Sark," and pointed below. Apparently, proper spelling under pressure was not one of Duncan's advertised skills. Out of the blue, a Cadillac drove past, at least something the size of a Cadillac. Vivian recognized in a split second the 18-foot tiger shark speeding past them. He was massive, magnificent, and terrifying at the same time. As Vivian watched the shark, Duncan pulled her in front of him with a swift jerk, so she was facing outward. "Oh, that's nice," she thought. "He's concerned about my safety." She began to feel uncomfortable, though, as Duncan clamped onto her buoyancy control vest so tightly she couldn't move at all. "Geez, I must be blocking his view of the shark." She peered into the murky depths, hoping to catch another glimpse of the automobile-sized pelagic. She wasn't disappointed. A grayish blob sped into focus. From above, the shark's broad head had a squarish look to it. This time, it came close enough for Vivian to see the distinctive side markings, those brownish tiger-like stripes. Below its belly, the claspers indicated it was a male. The creature moved so swiftly and gracefully, she had to marvel at its majestic presence and sheer size. It was wider across than her first studio apartment in Manhattan. Duncan gripped her. Vivian didn't like being held so forcefully. She squirmed to get him to loosen up. Without warning, the gray Cadillac shot up from below, its mouth agape. As the beast drew rapidly nearer, Vivian felt herself being pushed outward toward the oncoming death machine. What the heck was Duncan doing? She whooshed through the water like a rag doll. The force of being pushed forward caused her legs to swing out from under her. Her fins shot out toward the open water within reach of the shark's massive jaws. Vivian felt a sickening tug on her leg. She expected to see a dark cloud of her blood tinging the seawater. At that depth, the color red would appear black in the available light. They say when a shark shears off a limb, it's so swift the victim can barely feel it. She waited a second and looked down with trepidation. The shark had bitten off a large chunk of her right fin, leaving a perfect half-moon set of jagged tooth marks. She began to feel something she rarely felt, fear, and found it was possible to sweat underwater. Thank you. So I'm happy to, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take any questions. Oh, yes? So Laura asked if I have seen tiger sharks. I haven't seen a tiger shark, but I have actually been in many close calls with sharks. So it's fun, but definitely you need to enjoy that kind of thing. Yes, Zoe. Zoe wants me to tell a hot dog story. Okay, I was diving one time, feeding these little Vienna sausages to the fish, and just breaking off a piece and then throwing it, and the fish would come. And there happened to be a giant grouper nearby, and I had the Vienna sausages in a plastic bag, and the grouper came and clamped on my hand, and I was trying to get the plastic bag away because I didn't want him to choke. But then he was clamping on my hand so hard, I was like, all right, just take the whole thing. So he ate all the sausages, and he spit out the plastic bag. And that night, I had grouper for dinner. Any other questions? All right, we can just enjoy the party then, and I'll do another reading later on. Okay, thank you.